If you're a lawyer who uses Claude a lot for your work, you might have noticed that at times it seems to know everything about you and have perfect context of whatever matter you're working on. And other times, it seems to get amnesia and forget everything. I'm going to explain the fundamentals of how memory works in large language models. We're going to be specifically looking at Claude in this video, but everything I'm about to say also applies to other models like ChatGPT. What's surprising to a lot of people is that AI models don't actually have any memory whatsoever. Every time you start a new chat, they get complete amnesia and forget everything you've ever told them. Now, having just said that every time you start a new session, Claude gets total amnesia, why don't we ask it a question like, what is my name? It's going to tell me my name is Tommy, so what's going on here? How is it able to understand my name in a brand new session if it gets amnesia every single time? Well, let's start a new chat, and this time I'm going to ask it, what is my favorite food? Something I've never told Claude. If we take a look at Claude's response, we can see here that Claude is telling me that I never told it my favorite food, and so that's why it's pretty confused here. Let's try a new prompt. This time I'm also going to ask it, what is my favorite food? But before I ask it that, I'm going to append this notes here. And in the notes, I'm just telling it my favorite food is ice cream. We take a look here, Claude is easily able to say ice cream. And you might be thinking, well, that's kind of dumb. Obviously, if you tell it what your favorite food is, it's going to be able to answer the question, what is your favorite food? But that's exactly what's going on with memory in Claude or ChatGPT. Thinking again about how did Claude know my name when I'm telling you that every single new chat gives it complete amnesia. Let's take a look at this diagram. And on the right, this is me typing in what is my name. And on the left, we get Claude's response, which is just Tommy. Now, the thing is, when you are in the Claude app, you do not necessarily get to see every single message that Claude is going to read. You do not get to see everything in its context window. And just like how in the second prompt, I explicitly added some notes that said, my favorite food is ice cream, which basically gave Claude the answer in terms of how to answer the question, what is my favorite food? When you start talking to Claude, it is going to put a bunch of stuff in the prompt before your message that is going to help Claude do its work. So in the context of what is my name, Claude probably appended some kind of text that looked exactly like this. It just says, hey, the user's name is Tommy. Maybe it says your email address. Maybe there's some other things about you. And so even though in the chat that we looked at in Claude, we weren't able to see the user notes, that had to have been there in order for Claude to tell us what my name was. The Claude app does have a native memory feature, but notice how I'm saying the Claude app. Claude, the large language model, and Claude, the desktop app, are two different things. Claude, the large language model, is just one part of Claude, the desktop app, which is really a software product. And if we go over into the screen, we can take a look at the memory settings in the settings page on the bottom left. And there's two options here. One is search and reference chats, and the other is generate memory from chats. If you have generate memory from chats enabled, Claude is essentially going to keep a file on your computer of notes that it's going to maintain about you. So if you're an attorney and you work in transactional in the state of Delaware, for instance, and you continue to ask it legal questions about things in Delaware, it might add an entry into your notes that says, the user is an attorney that works on transactional matters in Delaware. And for this hypothetical user, when they log into Claude and ask it a question like, what do I do? It's able to answer transactional law in Delaware because Claude is the one that's maintaining these notes. So if we imagine this hypothetical transactional attorney going into Claude and asking a question like, what do I do? If Claude is able to answer transactional law in Delaware, it's because Claude was manually maintaining a set of notes in a file on your computer, and it's literally just writing stuff down, like if you or I were writing notes about one another. So it's going to write something like, the user is an attorney that works on transactional matters in Delaware. The thing with the managed memory, though, is Claude is completely in control of when it's going to write this file and what it's going to put into there. This can be sort of problematic, especially if you use Claude for a lot of different matters. If you're an attorney and you're often asking about legal matters, it might be useful for Claude to understand a bit about your practice, where you're located, and that type of thing. But if you also use it for personal stuff, the notes might get bloated with some other information. It might look like this. Let's imagine that over time, Claude has updated its notes file to include this information about you. So it remembers that you're an attorney that works on transactional matters in Delaware, but it also remembers that you love ice cream and also that you have a dog named Spot. The reason this can get a little weird is you might ask it a question like, what do I do? And Claude is going to answer in transactional law in Delaware, but it's also seeing that, well, he loves ice cream and his dog's name is Spot. So I probably need to use that information if it's being provided to me in the prompt. And so you might get a weird response like transactional law in Delaware. Have you had any ice cream today? Well, it's true that Claude learned that you like ice cream. That might have nothing to do whatsoever with the particular thing you're asking Claude to do in the moment. If you've ever heard the expression, don't think of a pink elephant, this is kind of what's going on here. And that expression, by the way, is something from psychology. But basically, if you tell someone not to think of a pink elephant, they basically are guaranteed to start picturing a pink elephant in their mind. It's a helpful way to think about what's actually going on when Claude puts stuff into the prompt from its memory on your behalf. It's also why I don't really like allowing Claude to generate automatic memories about me. even though the prompt has nothing to do with ice cream or nothing to do about my dog's spot, if Claude is getting some information in the prompt, it's thinking that it probably needs to use that. And another way to think about this is imagine you were taking something like a physics exam in high school or college, and a lot of times those exams gave you a lot of information and you need to use every single piece of information. So it might be some kind of problem where it was like the car is going 30 miles an hour and it's blue and the back left door was open and blah, 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 blah. And then you had to compute some metric. With a question like that, you might spend a few minutes working on it and then eventually get to an answer. And then you might reread the question. And as you're rereading the question, you might look at it and go, oh, shoot, I never used the fact that the car was blue. Why would the teacher put this information into the exam if I wasn't supposed to use it? And that's going to make you second guess yourself. And that's going to make you a lot less confident in your answer. And it's probably going to make you rethink how you're even going to answer the question in the first place. So in this example, it's kind of benign if Claude is just going to include some random facts about you. And it is pretty smart. So I think it can get over that hump of understanding that the information is not relevant. But just know that anything you say can and will be used against you. Anything in the context window is going to influence Claude. And honestly, if it's not relevant, or especially if you're steering it down a wrong path, you don't want that in the context window. It is going to confuse Claude and generally make the results worse and more confusing. Now, the second type of memory is search and reference chats. What this does is it allows Claude to go in and on the spot read past chats. So it's not that it's continually learning from everything you've talked about, but if you ask it, hey, what did we talk about a few days ago? It's actually able to go in and reread each chat on the spot. I personally don't like enabling either of these memories. And if I were using ChatGPT, I would also disable the similar feature, but this is totally up to you. Okay, so now we're going to go into a new chat and I'm going to ask Claude a question. What do I do for work? Except this time I'm actually going to connect it to a folder on my desktop called memory demo. And if we take a look in this folder, we've got a few different things. First, we've got some matters. All these are completely made up, but it's basically case notes, motions, that kind of thing, just for illustrative purposes. And if we go up, I've also got this user notes file .txt. And it doesn't really matter where this came from, but just note that if Claude is going to be able to answer this question accurately, it's probably going to have to read this actual file. And if we take a look here, again, it's completely made up. I'm saying my name is Ronald McDonald, but it's talking about what I do for work and all of that kind of stuff. If you take a look at the chat, you'll see that Claude realized that it probably needed to read the user notes.txt file, and it did exactly that in order to answer the question. It also found the matters folder and started asking me some questions about them. This is another form of AI memory, and you can think of this in the following way. Imagine that in the user notes, maybe in addition to what Claude wrote down about you manually, it's also going to have this message, which Claude, the app, is going to inject and says you have access to a folder and can read the files. And because it knows that it's in a folder, it's going to poke around and look at different things. So when I ask it, what do? It takes a look at the folder and it's going to open it in a way that is similar to how you or I look at it in Finder. And imagine you just gave somebody this folder and told them nothing other than, what do? Well, they might actually just look at the file names. And just using your intuition, you might figure out that, okay, well, user notes might have some information, it might not, but I might as well read it. And so Claude's going to decide to read it. And even if there isn't information that's relevant, it's good for it to know that that file is or is not relevant. So if it doesn't find anything, it at least knows that it needs to look somewhere else. Now, once it opens the file and reads it, it's probably going to figure out this is plenty to answer the question, or it might continue exploring. And so it can open up subfolders. So it opened up the matters subfolder, and then it took a look at the different files. And again, I'm not telling Claude how I organize things or what the different files mean, but you don't really need to, because if there's any semblance of organization, Claude is pretty smart. It's going to figure it out. And even if you never met me and you just looked at this folder, you might be able to figure out, well, it looks like the name of each subfolder is a case name. And that does not take a very high IQ to figure out. It's pretty obvious from the name. Now I'm going to start another chat, only this time I'm not going to connect it to a folder. And this time I'm just going to paste in the contents of that user notes.txt file. The response, of course, is not going to be exactly identical to the one in the other chat, but it did find all of that same information in the user notes file. And again, this is just to illustrate that copying and pasting the contents of a file into the chat is basically what's going on under the hood. You're just not really aware of it. And of course, in this instance, it didn't know about the matter files, which makes sense because I didn't actually paste any of that information into the chat. But all you need to do to give Claude memory is to just put some stuff into the context window, is to actually just type some stuff into the chat window. Also point out that this is just a regular file on your computer. It does not really matter if Claude is maintaining this or if you're maintaining this. And what I mean by that is you are free to go in and add some information here at your will. You don't need to wait for Claude to add information. You can populate the memory with anything you'd like. Or you could tell Claude in your chats, that it's something that Claude should be appending to. So as it learns more about you, it should keep track of this file. And that's going to look a lot more similar to the built-in Claude memory feature, only you're in a bit more control. Now let's talk about Claude.md. If you've been working with Claude in particular, you might have heard about this file. It's talked about as a memory file for Claude, and that's totally true. If you open up a Claude.md, it's just going to contain text because it is a markdown file at the end of the day. This is, again, very similar to just having a regular file. The only thing that's different about Claude.md is that Anthropic has trained Claude to always look for this file, and it pretty much always will read this regardless of what you put into the instructions. And you can have a lot of information about the project, about who you are, about what your goals are, or in the Claude.md, you can actually just tell it explicitly to read other files. And this can be useful when you have information scattered across different files. You don't necessarily want to jam every single thing about your business, every single thing about you in a single file. It's easier to maintain separately and kind of have that main index. But the fundamental thing to understand about a Claude.md is it's not any different than putting information in other files. The only difference really is that Claude is really going to look for the file and almost always read it for you. You're not required to use a Claude.md, and if you put information in another file and just tell Claude to read that other file, you basically recreated what the Claude.md does and should get very similar results. I'll also add that everything I'm saying here applies to any model you're using. So that applies to both Anthropic and OpenAI models, but it also applies to the different models within a provider. So Anthropic has Fable 5, Opus 5, Sonnet 5, all these different models. It also has different effort levels, and it has some legacy models as well. None of them are any different. They all work by creating these conversations, putting information into the conversation, sometimes hiding it from you. And that's why what I'm saying here applies to any of them. It's not like Fable has better memory than Opus 5. If you wanted to remember stuff about you long term, you've got to manage files or let Claude manage a file about you and your business or whatever on your behalf.